Hello class, this is Marcella again, and for today's lecture we're going to be talking about other even age system. So in class last time we talked about the Clearcut and the Clearcut system. So removing all the trees, allocating all that growing space to a new cohort, potentially tending it with thinning, and then a future harvest. So we talked about the rotation with clear cutting. Today we're going to be talking about other systems we can use to maintain an even age stand. So in this cover photo, hopefully you're looking out and you're seeing a slew of aspen. So aspen can be managed with a coppice system. So a coppice system is a low forestry method. And we're also going to try something new this time. So instead of me pausing and giving you time to write, I'm going to ask you to pause the lecture to write this stuff down. So pause for a second and then write what a low forestry method is. So a low forestry method is a forest produced from vegetative regeneration. So that's shoots or suckers. So we're talking about asexual regeneration. And in this picture, we have an example of a coppice harvest coppice harvest of willow. And in lecture, I mentioned that coppice is a common way that is a common way to harvest aspen, and also commonly used in European countries for, again, a way to manage with asexual regeneration, with willow being one example here. So with a coppice, you're removing all trees, so clear felling. So this coppice can be done in blocks, strips, or patches. And what you're focusing on is the regeneration through suckers, a shoot arising from a rhizome or root. So a coppice, as we're talking about, sounds extremely similar to a clear cut. But a clear cut, we're talking about either seed, so we're talking about sexual reproduction basically. We're talking about seeds, or we're talking about planting. So it can be artificial, it could be natural, but we're talking about generally a high forestry method, so something with sexual reproduction. Whereas a coppice, we're focusing on asexual reproduction, so suckers arising from the rhizome or root. So I mentioned in class, coppice, this dates back to 4500 BCs, and there's some stumps that have been harvested for centuries. And this has been, these products, this coppice harvest has been used for a variety of products, including firewood, fencing, and furniture. And we think about it, firewood is something that in Europe is extremely important. The European civilizations date back thousands and thousands of years. So forests have been used for a long time. And one of those important products that's used from our forest is firewood. And this is a way, using a coppice system, where you can get firewood back relatively quickly. So you have your trees to be coppiced. You cut them close to the base in winter, and we're going to go over why we cut them in the winter. The shoots rapidly regrow from the stool the following spring, and the coppice is ready for harvest between 7 and 20 years, so very quick. So a harvest with coppice, again, you're allocating all that growing space to a new age class. However, unlike with our clear-cut method with seeds, these suckers, this asexual reproduction method, these already have a well-established and large root system. So they already have a head start. They have the ability to get water, to get nutrients. They can reach closed canopy sooner because of this, and these ultra-short rotations can be used for energy production. So here's just again an example with willow trees, and again, very short rotations. We're talking about 3, 4, or 5 years. So focusing on aspen and something that's closer to Minnesota. So root suckers, they arise from shallow roots, and generally they don't decline over repeated rotation. So repeated coppices don't decline the vigor of these root suckers. And like in the example before, we're harvesting during the dormant season or winter. Why do we want to harvest during the dormant season? Pause. Okay. Hopefully you came up with a few ideas of why we're harvesting during the dormant season, and that has to do with food reserves. So we think about it. The food reserves are stored in the roots and are at their maximum during winter and fall. So the leaves have fallen off. The tree has put all its reserves to overwinter, and it's there. So all those reserves are there in the roots. Whereas when we think about in the spring or summer, there's a lot of nutrients, there's a lot of material being moved up and down the tree. So there's less reserves there, so there's less suckering. So when you're using a coppice, when you're using vegetative reproduction, when you're focusing on vegetative reproduction, you want to do this during the dormant season, so fall or winter. So let's think of some advantages of using a coppice system. And again, pause your lecture and, I should tell you, think of two advantages and two disadvantages for the coppice system, and pause your lecture to write those down. So hopefully you paused your lecture and you've written a few things down. So let's see what we can compare between them. So advantages, they're simple. So very simple with very good regeneration. Abundant shoots, so you look at Aspen, we saw that cover picture, that was about 2 years after a harvest. So there's a ton of shoots there. This is good for fiber quality. It's good for short rotation. So we talked about potential for biomass energy, also potential for pulp. It creates a uniform stand, and if we're looking at the landscape scale, if we create different patches of different ages of this coppice system, of aspen, say, if we created different age classes, this could produce a very high landscape level diversity. So within the stand, the diversity is going to be very low, but at a landscape level, much higher. It also produces good wildlife habitat for certain species. Some disadvantages, you need a market, so you need to be able to sell this product. And there's also a limited set of management goals and a few species. And we also have to be careful not to damage the soils. So coppice with standards. So we're going to be talking about this one, and this one can be borderline. So it can be a true even age system, or it can move into a 2-age system depending on what you do with those standards. So a coppice with standards is the removal of some to much of the stand with some trees left, and those are our reserves or standards. So why might we leave the trees? Pause and write one reason down. So some reasons why we might leave the trees. We can keep them as seed trees. They increase visual appeal. They also can increase wildlife habitat. So if we leave these trees up, the stand becomes a 2-age system. If we remove the trees at some later date, the stand maintains its even-aged age class structure. So what are some advantages of a coppice with standards? Again, you're going to write down 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages. Pause this lecture and do that right now. So hopefully you've had a chance to write a few things down. Let's see how we compare. So advantage, there's a yield of several different diameter classes, especially if you keep the standards and maintain them. So large trees continue to grow larger and produce seeds. They provide shade and shelter. It's a visual, greater structural diversity. However, some disadvantages, it's more complex. There's exposure and potential for future blowdowns, and shading may limit suckering. May also take on more open growth forms. So there may be more branchiness and not as may decrease the quality of the tree. So we covered Coppice, which focuses on asexual reproduction. Now we're going to move into some other methods of even age management, and one of the first ones is a Shelterwood. So the cover page, this is some work I did while I was out in Utah, and this is a Shelterwood with Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. So the goal was to try to get regeneration of Engelmann spruce. So what is a Shelterwood? So the Shelterwood is a cutting of most of the trees, leaving those needed to produce sufficient shade to produce a new age class in a moderated environment. So we have our uncut stand, and we're going to go through these different cuts in greater detail in a few slides. So we have our uncut stand. We have a preparatory cut, so some kind of cut to prep the stand. And then we have our establishment cut. So we have, unlike a traditional clear cut, we have trees that we're leaving. And we're leaving these trees to produce both shade and seed. So we're producing shade and also seed. So the shade is to moderate the microenvironment. And after we have this establishment, we then have a removal cut. So again, here's another example of what Shelterwood looks like. We have our uncut stand, we have our preparatory cut, we have our establishment cut, and finally we have the removal cut. So the three cuts of a Shelterwood. So first one is a preparatory cut. And this is an optional initial treatment to increase tree vigor and seed production within a mature stand. So why might we do a preparatory cut or a prep cut? Pause and write down one reason. So we might do this to make sure our trees are wind firm. So we might do this preparatory cut to make sure we're removing some of that base layer, we're removing some of that density, and we're making sure those trees that we're leaving behind are wind firm. And then in the next cut, we can do that even more so. So our next cut is a seeding or establishment cut. And that's a treatment to establish regeneration throughout the stand area. So we're modifying the environment for seedling development. So the trees that we're leaving behind, the goal of those trees that we're leaving behind is for seed and also to moderate the environment, to provide shelter. And then the final cut is the removal or final cutting. And that's the harvest to take away the overwood, so those remaining trees, so that the new community can develop uninhibited. So when would we want to remove it? Pause for a second and think. So we want to remove this overwood before seedlings become limited by light or competition. And we also want them to be flexible. So we're going to be going in to do a harvest. So there is potential to damage this regeneration. So we want our trees still to be flexible so they can bounce back. And we also want to do it before they become limited by light. So we're leaving these trees, we are leaving this overwood to produce some kind of shelter, but we don't want that shelter to limit these seedlings. So it's a fine line on balancing this. So an example from Minnesota is northern red oak management. So northern red oak, one way we can manage northern red oak is with a Shelterwood. And so northern red oak is a mid-tolerant species. So generally when we're looking at a stand, what we would do is remove competition. And that means trees both in the overstory and in that mid-story. So we want to produce this kind of open quality habitat. And what we're leaving behind, so we're taking out a lot, but what we're leaving behind is high quality oak. And this high quality oak will serve as a seed source and shade. And generally we're leaving about 40 to 70% canopy cover. So we want it to be open, but not too open. So very different than a Clearcut where we have 0% canopy cover. So we're leaving a good amount of canopy cover. And then again, we have the removal cut once oak seedlings are established. So, Shelterwood characteristics. The goal is to provide shelter, so i.e. shade and seed. So the Shelterwood versus the Clearcut, what are the differences? Pause your lecture for a second and take a moment to write down at least one difference between a Shelterwood and a Clearcut. So hopefully there's some pretty obvious differences that you were able to write down between a Shelterwood and a Clearcut. So the big question is how the regeneration environment is different. And that big difference is there's less extreme temperature and light. So there's some kind of shade, there's some kind of shelter. So that means less extremes when we're talking about temperature and light. There will probably be increased soil moisture, but not as much. So we still have overstory trees transpiring and sucking up some of that water. And there will be some decomposition. So we had the removal of part of the stand. So we are opening up the stand. But again, we're not opening it up as much as a Clearcut. So here's another example of a kind of Shelterwood management with white pine. And this example is a uniform Shelterwood. And what does a uniform Shelterwood mean? So let's look at these different ways we can look at a Shelterwood. So a uniform Shelterwood means that generally we're taking out trees pretty uniformly. So it creates this nice kind of grid pattern almost. Whereas we can also look at a group Shelterwood. So we're more creating patches or groups where we want to focus our regeneration. We can also do a strip Shelterwood. So there's all different ways we can leave those overstory trees. So there's all kinds of different ways we can group them or leave that overwood, depending on what kind of species it is, depending on the sylvics of that species. So the third type of system I want to talk about is a seed tree system. So here we're seeing a seed tree system on ponderosa pine out west. So what is a seed tree? So it's cutting of all the trees except for a small number of widely dispersed trees retained for seed production and to produce a new age class in a fully exposed microenvironment. So looking at this, we have our mature stand, we have our seed tree cut, we have our establishment, we have the removal cut, and then we have our tending of our stand. So we're looking at our full rotation. So from mature stand to our harvest, which takes that happens over multiple cuttings, to the tending, to our harvest, regeneration, and tending. So seed tree sequence of events. So again, we can do 3 cuts. And in the previous example, we see this is done in only 2 cuts. So that first cut is optional. In this example, we go from that seed tree cut to the removal cut. There is no preparatory cut. But we can do a preparatory cut, again, to make sure we're getting the stand wind firm and prepared. And then we do the seed or seeding cut. And here's some examples with red and white pine generally. We're talking about leaving 3 to 10 trees per acre. Whereas down south with loblolly and slash pine, you're leaving up to 30 trees per acre. So we're talking about a pretty big difference in the number of trees we're leaving per acre. And the number of trees you leave really depends on the sylvics. So we have preparatory cut, seed or seeding cut, and then finally the removal cut. So, characteristics of a seed tree. So the goal is to retain the retention of residual trees as a source of seed. So we're only looking at this for a source of seed. And generally the environmental conditions are similar to a clear cut. So here's an example from the Cloquet Forestry Center with a seed tree harvest of red pine. So again, the goal of this is the retention of these trees as a source of seed. So what's the difference between a seed tree and the shelterwood? So hint, think about the goals for each of them. So pause and write down the difference between a seed tree and a shelterwood. And this would be a very good question that might show up on a quiz and probably most definitely will show up on an exam. So difference between seed tree and shelterwood. So hopefully you wrote down, with the shelterwood, your goal is to produce both shade and seed. Whereas a seed tree, you're only focused on seed production. So what makes good leaf trees? So what makes good trees that we're leaving to produce seed, to produce shelter? And how are we going to select trees that will serve as our future seed source? So write down two aspects that you would look for when you are thinking about leaving these trees. So pause. So hopefully what you're thinking about, you want them to be phenotypically superior. So you want them to look like a good tree. So that might be a straight bowl, that might be the kind of crown. You also want them to be prolific in seeding and flowering. So the goal of leaving these trees is to produce seed for both the shelterwood and the seed tree. So you need trees that are going to produce. You also want them to be sturdy and healthy. So it's going to be a rather open environment. So you want these trees to hold up. So again, with silviculture, we're always focusing on what we're leaving behind. So we want to select the highest quality trees. So we're keeping our best genetic stock. So other considerations, and this picture is from one of my field sites in Utah, and this is from that shelterwood. So there is the possibility of wind throw. So wind and blow down, and this is really going to vary based on where you are and what species you're working with. So phenotypic characteristics. So is it shallow rooted? Does it have a large crown ratio? That might mean in winter or whatever, we can get some breakage. Also the physical site characteristics. What's the soil like? What's moisture levels? Also physiographic features such as slope and aspect. How is the wind blowing? And then finally, individual tree characteristics. So you're always trying to think about all these things. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Some stands are more prone to blow down, and that's something you can either work around and include. So by having a blow down, we're producing down dead wood, and that's an important resource for animals and certain plants and certain microorganisms. So that's an important resource. It may not fit within your objectives, your management goals and objectives. So this is one thing to consider and either use as an advantage or maybe work around. So the other big question, how many trees to leave? And this is going to be very based on the individual stand and the individual species you're working with. So really it comes down, a shelterwood, you want to produce shade and seed. So depending on your species, the amount of shade needed is going to vary. Whereas with a seed tree, you just want to produce seed. So depending on how it can disperse the seed, that's going to vary. So just to give you an example, again, one last picture of an alternative. So we talked about how we can arrange that Shelterwood, and here's just another example. So here's a strip Shelterwood. Again, we have the initial strip, and then we have our reserve trees, and then those will be harvested later. So with that, that is the end of this section on other even age management systems. Thank you.